You all know Magdalena is an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. And very briefly, she did her undergraduate work at Cornell, got an MPH at Yale, got a DRPH at Harvard, did some other amazing things, including an RWJ Health and Society Fellowship at the University of Michigan. And here she is.
Great, thank you so much. Should I use this
So here's how this works. The toggles on the left-hand side will give you forward and
Okay.
back.
Okay.
Do we know if anybody's watching from Davis? Or?
Nobody is watching. That's only a recording.
I got you.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to be talking about one area of my work, which is neighborhood influences on violence, and I'm particularly interested in research on neighborhoods that actually can lead to interventions and that can inform interventions. So there's been a proliferation of research on neighborhoods and violence in the past 15 years. As you can see from these and many other papers that have been produced, and it's really been focused on observational studies, looking at how neighborhoods may influence different types of violent outcomes. The question is, given this bulk of observational research, where are we headed next? Where is the research on neighborhoods and violence headed? And so I think there's two areas where I think we can make an important impact. I think one is that given the bulk of observational research, it's time to shift from observation to action. That is, figuring out, going from studying how neighborhoods influence violence to how can we intervene on neighborhoods to reduce violence. And second, and related to the first, it's important to identify intervention targets that we can use, that we can intervene on to improve population health, reduce violence, and also reduce disparities in violence. And my focus was particularly on reducing racial disparities in violence. So building on these two directions, we have focused on research that can lead to intervention, that can inform intervention. And there are two areas that I think we can do work that leads to intervention. And I'm going to be talking about one example in each of these areas of work that I've done. So first is, I think we can use natural experiments to learn how we can reduce violence by intervening on neighborhoods. And the second area is that I think in order to inform community trials, we have an exciting opportunity to simulate intervention targets to reduce disparities in violence. And so I'm going to be talking about each of these areas in turn. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about natural experiments and how we can learn how to reduce violence. And particularly focusing here on transforming neighborhoods as a way to reduce violence. So with natural experiments, the great thing about natural experiments is that we can learn from real circumstances. The treatment occurs in the neighborhood, so it actually helps us answer an appropriate question, which is what happens if you intervene on neighborhoods. Because the treatment is at the neighborhood level, it's actually exogenous to the resident population, and in that way we can sort out what's due to the neighborhood from what's due to the people who live in the neighborhood, and get at a better causal effect of intervention at the neighborhood level. It also, because we're evaluating real interventions, it actually provides evidence that is of direct public health value. That is, we can learn from natural experiments what actually would work, what could work in other settings. And in addition, I think it helps us evaluate the impact that non-health structural interventions and policies can have on health. And I think particularly when doing research on neighborhoods, we've learned that a lot of times there's non-traditional health interventions actually have a great impact, could have a potential great impact on health. And so if we want to intervene on neighborhoods, it's not really going to be the public health sector that's going to do that, but it's working with other sectors. So as an example of the value of this type of work, I'm going to be talking about one particular study that we did. So this study builds on years of research that I've been doing in the city of Medellin in Colombia. This is the second largest city. It's the industrial center of the country. It has known a long history of violence, particularly related to drugs. And so what was interesting is that what happened is, so if you see a map here of the city of Medellin, and the darker areas are areas with more concentrated poverty, lighter areas, less concentrated poverty. So you can see there's a lot of residential segregation by income in this city. And I was interested in seeing, well, how can we intervene in these poorest neighborhoods in the northeast section of the city to reduce these rates of violence? And while I was doing some of my dissertation work there, it so happened that there was this innovation built by the municipality. The municipality decided to build urban gondolas to connect these neighborhoods in the northeast section, in the mountainous periphery of the city, to the city center, to the metro line that runs across the city center. So this is a photo of the urban gondola, so you can see it's kind of like a ski lift. Connecting these neighborhoods that are the poorest, physically isolated from the rest of the city, and the most violent neighborhoods. But to me, interested in neighborhoods, what was interesting was not so much the urban gondola in itself, but what happened around it. So around all the gondola stations, the municipality decided to invest in the neighborhoods. They built public spaces, so parks around the gondola stations. They improved the lighting in the neighborhoods. They invested in family police stations. And just walking around there, I noticed that there was a proliferation of small businesses around these areas. So I hypothesized that such an investment in urban renewal, particularly the availability of police, the growth of small businesses, and the availability of safe public spaces could contribute to a reduction in violence. And I wanted to test that. So in order to do so, to test the impact that this intervention had on violence, what we did is we did a pre-post intervention control design. So what happened is that luckily we had pre-intervention data on all the neighborhoods in the city of Medellin, and on the residents of the neighborhoods. So what we did is we selected our survey participants who lived in the intervention neighborhoods, and we used propensity score matching to match them to a set of comparable control neighborhoods. That is comparable on homicide, on pre-intervention levels of homicide, on social class, on economic characteristics. And we had pre-intervention data on about 600 people living in the intervention and control neighborhoods, as well as data on their neighborhoods. Then the gondola was built in 2004, and then we followed up the same people in 2008. So we were able to get data on about 470 people who we had both pre and post-intervention data on in terms of the intervention and control group. And so what did we find? We wanted to see, well, do the intervention neighborhoods, did they experience a greater decrease in violence over time than the matched control neighborhoods? And so what you see here is a decline in violence. The dark bars are the intervention neighborhoods, and the gray bars are the control neighborhoods. The top two bars show you the decline in the log odds of reports of violence by neighborhood residents, and the bottom two bars show you a decline in the log homicide rate. And so what you can see here is that there was a greater decrease in both reports of violence and in the rate of homicide in the intervention than in the control neighborhoods. So what did we learn from this first natural experiment? Well, we learned that indeed investment in the neighborhood infrastructure and the physical infrastructure can have an important impact on violence in these neighborhoods and can be an effective tool to prevent violence. And that these non-health policies can actually have important unintended effects. That is, this was an intervention that there was no intent to reduce violence. The only intent of this intervention was to improve mobility of the residents and to better integrate these neighborhoods into the city. But yet they had all these other important consequences. It's important to understand also that we evaluated a bundled intervention. That is, this intervention including interventions in terms of policing, in terms of physical space, and in terms of economic well-being, and in terms of transit. So this is not really comparable to the effects that you may see in an observational study where you just isolate the effect that one particular neighborhood characteristic may have on violence. However, I think that I see this as a value, as an advantage, because in the real world, when you do interventions, especially interventions on neighborhoods, it's likely not going to be on just one area, but it's actually going to be a bundled package attacking different aspects of a neighborhood. And this gives us an idea of the impact that such investment in neighborhoods can have on violence. However, at the same time, this is the issue with the bundled interventions is that you can't really pinpoint, well, what about this neighborhood intervention had an impact on violence? And it's also important to be able to pinpoint those targets for the design of future interventions. That is, what exactly worked. And so I think we can couple this use of these opportunities, these natural experiments, with actual simulations where we can actually try to pinpoint and identify potential intervention targets that we can then examine further with real data with other experiments. And so the second area of research for me is trying to simulate these intervention targets to reduce violence and to reduce disparities in violence. So I'm going to be and this forms part of a larger program of research on simulations related to violence prevention. But I'm going to be talking about the first paper that is coming out of this work, which is really trying to ask the question about, can universal or targeted interventions reduce racial and ethnic disparities in violence? But before I get to the particular study that we did, I want to step back for a moment and give a broader context for our thought process for this. So if you think about population health and what's the objective of population health, it's really to understand why disease varies across populations. And not so much to ask why do some individuals have disease, but rather why do some populations have greater rates of disease than higher rates of disease than other populations. So, for example, if you look at this famous graph shown by Jeffrey Rose, one thing you could do, one question you could answer equally well. This is a graph of systolic blood pressure in Kenyan nomads and in London civil servants. One question you could ask equally well in each of the populations is, why do some individuals have hypertension and others don't? However, that would take away from a more interesting question, which would be, why is it that London civil servants have a mean level of hypertension when Kenyan nomads do not experience hypertension? That is, what differentiates these two groups? And that has to do more with the population mean. And how can we intervene? That begs the question, how can we intervene to shift the distribution of systolic blood pressure among London civil servants so that it looks more like the Kenyan nomads? So one type of intervention that we can think about to do that is a targeted intervention. That is an intervention focusing on the highest risk group and trying to truncate the distribution. That has definite advantages. It brings about enhanced motivation for the individual, and it's shown to be more cost effective. However, it also has some disadvantages. First of all, it doesn't really address the root of the problem, so it's palliative and temporary. And moreover, it actually brings about less of a population level impact because, interestingly enough, most of the cases of disease are actually brought on by those people at low risk of disease. That is, there are few people at high risk for disease, but rather there's many people at low risk for disease that actually contribute the largest number of cases. So we're going to have a much better impact if we intervene in the general population at low risk for disease. So that brings us to the other alternative, which is the universal intervention. And this is what Jeffrey Rose wrote about the value of intervening across the whole population in order to shift the whole distribution. And so, for example, that would be environmental reform campaigns, or environmental control measures, or social norm reform campaigns that actually try to shift the whole distribution of the population by targeting those people at low or mid-level risk for disease. However, there is a complicating factor. So Jeffrey Rose proposed we must do universal interventions in order to have the maximum population level impact on rates of disease. However, there is a complicating factor, and that's fundamental causes. So according to the theory on fundamental causes, there's always going to be a sector of the population that's going to be at risk for disease, regardless of what the disease is. So the disease might be cholera, and then after cholera it might be cardiovascular disease, or it might be lung cancer. And regardless of what the disease is, even if one solves, quote unquote, the disease, the same people are going to be dying from whatever the new topic is. And why is that? It's because we haven't addressed those root causes that lead certain people to optimize resources to take advantage of interventions, and other people's too vulnerable to be able to take advantage of these interventions. A clear example of this is with tobacco. Universal interventions on tobacco have brought down the smoking rates at the population level, but actually the racial disparities and particularly the income disparities in tobacco use have increased because the people with more resources have been better able to take advantage of these interventions, while more vulnerable groups have been less able to take advantage. And so this, an illustration of this notion is illustrated here with this graph, where you have the distribution of disease before the intervention and then after the intervention. And so you can think that a universal intervention might bring the mean population level of disease down, but at the same time it might increase the variance in the disease. And that's because the concentration of benefits is really within the lowest risk group, whereas the highest risk group experiences little change in disease. One source of these fundamental factors that lead to disparities in disease is racial residential segregation. So this is a map of what was in the year 2000 the most segregated metropolitan area in the United States, which was Milwaukee. And so you can see the blue dots are the concentration of African Americans in the innermost neighborhoods of the city, and then the white dots are the concentration of white residents in the outskirts of the city. And so racial residential segregation leads African Americans to experience a concentrated set of risk factors that can make them vulnerable to a whole set of diseases and potentially less able to take advantage of universal interventions. So within this broad idea, we wanted to focus on a particular issue, to use a particular issue as a test case to test these notions about universal versus targeted interventions and the potential complicating role of fundamental causes. The issue is violence in the United States, and particularly the huge racial and ethnic disparities there are in violence. Why do we care about this? Well, because blacks are 6 times more likely to die from homicide than whites. So this is obviously a great public health problem, and if we want to do something about violence, we need to be concerned about racial disparities in violence. And so the question arises, first of all, how can we reduce violence, but also importantly, how can we reduce disparities in violence? So one intervention target that has received a lot of attention, not only in the United States, but actually internationally, even by bodies such as the World Bank, is collective efficacy as a prevention target. So collective efficacy is defined as shared values and trust among neighbors, and the collective capacity of neighbors to organize themselves towards a common goal. In particular, it's been looked at as the collective capacity to organize themselves to control deviant activities. And it's been found in studies in the United States, but also in Europe and in New Zealand, that collective efficacy arises in more stable, less economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, and it's been associated with lower violent victimization. So there have been many observational studies that have found that collective efficacy may be protective against the risk for victimization. However, we think that if we're thinking about, okay, then the next step is intervening on collective efficacy, we think that racial residential segregation may complicate this story. Because blacks live in more economically disadvantaged neighborhoods that already at a baseline have lower rates of collective efficacy, and they also have a set of other multiple risk factors. And so universal, particularly interventions to increase collective efficacy, will primarily benefit neighborhoods which already start out with higher baseline levels of collective efficacy. And because of that, because of where they live, blacks may be less able to take advantage of interventions on collective efficacy. That is, if we start out with a universal intervention, for example, that's going to more greatly benefit. You're going to see a greater increase in collective efficacy in neighborhoods that are already better off, where there's a higher concentration of white residents. Also, because of the higher rates of violence in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, that already those higher rates of violence are going to deteriorate the intervention on collective efficacy in such a way that the sustained high levels of collective efficacy are going to peter out earlier. So based on these ideas, we had two study questions. The first study question is going back to this idea of universal versus targeted interventions. And we wanted to ask, what is the relative impact of universal versus targeted interventions on collective efficacy on both population level rates of victimization and black-white disparities in victimization? The second question was related to this issue of the complicating role of residential segregation. And we wanted to see, well, what if we change residential segregation? Would that, particularly would the impact of these interventions on black-white disparities on victimization change? In order to do that, we used agent-based models. So agent-based models are a type of simulation. It's, if you've ever seen the game SimCity, it's kind of like playing SimCity, where you create this virtual world of agents, which are actually just dots on a computer program, but you give them the characteristics of a certain population, the demographic characteristics, the behavioral characteristics, and then you can actually simulate scenarios, different types of hypothetical experiments on the population. And because it's the same population that is experiencing different types of scenarios, you're simulating an experiment. And we think that these can be the first step to develop hypotheses, or more specific hypotheses, that we can test with community trials. I think we can also answer questions with this that would not be possible to answer with real data, because, for example, with residential segregation, we can't do an intervention that's going to change residential segregation across the whole city. So in this agent-based model, we specified neighborhood collective efficacy, and it was depended on the demographic characteristics of agents as well as neighborhood income. And collective efficacy would have an impact on violent victimization as well as violent perpetration. The interesting thing here is that we specified that violent acts would only happen if somebody with a high probability of being a victim would be within a 20-cell radius of somebody with a high probability of being a perpetrator. In that way, we were able to incorporate the influence that distal factors such as neighborhood characteristics, as well as more situational phenomena such as being next to people who you come across with on the street, how those both would combine to have an impact on the occurrence of violent acts. The simulated agent population was made to look like the population in New York City according to the 2000 census. And we simulated a population of 4,000 agents that lived on a 200 by 200 grid. We created an environment that was divided into 16 neighborhoods. We started out by assuming a scenario of complete segregation. That is, agents were assigned to neighborhoods based on their income and their race. And because we found that that actually replicated the New York City situation the best. And we allowed neighborhood income and violence to emerge from agent individual behaviors and characteristics. And we allowed collective efficacy to depend on past neighborhood income and violence, just as past research has told us it would do. At each step of the model, agents were able to age 1 year, they were able to perpetrate violence, and some agents were able to be victimized. We calibrated the model so that the behaviors of agents depended on past history of violence, agent demographics, and neighborhood characteristics. And in order to calibrate this model to specify agent probabilities, we use real data. So we use data from the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, as well as from a longitudinal study, longitudinal population-based study of adults in New York City, which is called the World Trade Center study. Just to give you an idea of what this model looks like, this is a screenshot of the model. So you can see here that agents are classified, so they're segregated by race and also by income. So the agents are the dots on the model, and as you can see, they're divided into neighborhoods. And as you can see, there's much greater concentration of whites in the higher income neighborhoods, where there's a higher concentration of minorities in the lower income neighborhoods, to reflect the situation in the year 2000 in New York City.
What are the axes on that?
So that's just the cells. That's the count of cells within the model.
200 by
200, exactly.
Blocks.
Yeah. And so we group the cells into neighborhoods. So the first thing that we wanted to do is, before you simulate interventions in these models, you actually have to make sure that you've specified the model in the right way. That is, does this population reflect the population you want it to reflect? And so we wanted it to reflect the data for New York City. And so the first thing we did before simulating the interventions is we looked at what kind of rates we were able to produce in terms of victimization in the past year and in lifetime per racial group. And so the estimates from ABM, that's the estimates from our agent-based model, we saw that they were comparable to published estimates, and they were comparable to data from our source calibration data. And so we were comfortable. We had actually replicated a population that was comparable to the New York City population and comparable to the victimization rates that we had seen in published data. So then we could actually go ahead and simulate interventions, simulate how would happen to this population if we exerted some changes. So the first question that we wanted to answer was, what is the relative impact of universal versus targeted interventions just on population level rates of victimization? So what you have here is, on the x-axis, you have increase in collective efficacy. And you have two scenarios. One is a universal intervention. That is, what if we increase collective efficacy across all neighborhoods in our model? And the other one is a targeted intervention, which is, what if we increase collective efficacy just on the most violent neighborhoods? And you have different scenarios of intensities of dose, right? So from increasing collective efficacy 1 standard deviation to increasing collective efficacy to its maximum value across the city. And on the y-axis, you have the % reduction in annual violent victimization. And so what we saw here is that universal interventions had a substantially greater impact in terms of reducing victimization than targeted interventions across levels of intervention. So that's what would have been predicted initially by our study, what is predicted by the writings of Jeffrey Rose on universal versus targeted interventions. However, the second question was, well, okay, but what happens with disparities? That is, what is the relative impact of universal versus targeted interventions on racial disparities in victimization? And so here, it's a very different story. And so here you have the same x-axis as the other graph, but the y-axis is black-white differences in the % victimized. So what you want is, so this, the leftmost is, the white bar is under a scenario of no intervention. We do nothing. And so what you want is the other bars to actually be lower than the white bar, right? You want to have an effect. You want to reduce these disparities. So here you have comparing the scenario of universal intervention and targeted intervention. And what do you see? You see that they're intervening on collective efficacy, regardless of whether you intervene across the whole city or you intervene in the most violent neighborhoods, has no impact on racial disparities. If anything, there's a slight increase in disparities with these interventions. So, okay, so when we saw that, we thought, okay, well, is this due to residential segregation? So what happens if we change the level of residential segregation? Might that change our findings? And so we looked at the impact of these interventions separately by racial group. And so first we looked at the reduction in victimization separately for blacks and whites under a context of complete segregation. And so here, again, you have at the x-axis different doses of universal versus targeted intervention, and on the y-axis you have the % reduction in annual victimization for blacks and whites. And so what you see is that under a context of complete segregation, universal interventions do better, but also whites always benefit more. That is, whites always experience a greater reduction in victimization from the collective efficacy intervention compared to blacks. Okay, so what if we change complete segregation? What about a scenario of no segregation? What happens then? So this is a completely different result, right? So this is the same graph, except now we've changed the scenario to assume no residential segregation. And so here you see a different story altogether, which is that under a scenario of no segregation, investment in collective efficacy has comparable effects for blacks and for whites. They experience comparable reductions in annual victimization, and the greatest impact is by increasing collective efficacy universally across the whole city. So what does this show us? Well, first of all, just at a general population level, universal neighborhood interventions on collective efficacy can reduce population level rates of violent victimization. However, if we do nothing about the fundamental causes that lead to these racial disparities and violence, neither a universal nor a targeted intervention on collective efficacy is going to have any impact on disparities. If we really want to have an impact on disparities, then we actually need to address things at a more distal level. And we need to actually address the structural drivers of these neighborhood conditions. That is, we need to address things like residential segregation, if we have any hope then of doing something about these racial disparities and violence. So these are just two examples of the research that I'm doing now to think about how context can influence violence and how we can inform interventions on violence. So how can I put this all together? I mean, I talked about two very different studies. So I think there's a couple of lessons learned from this kind of work. One is that with the natural experiments, we can actually use real circumstances to evaluate the effect of local neighborhood interventions. And with natural experiments, we can evaluate the effectiveness that these non-health policies can have on health, and particularly can have on violence. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to think creatively about emerging policy changes, emerging municipal interventions that we can evaluate for that. At the same time, I think we need to couple that kind of work with other work, for example, using simulations to help us refine hypotheses and understand the mechanisms that may be giving rise to some of the surprising results that we see in observational studies. So I think, first of all, simulations can help us identify potential targets for randomized controlled trials, but also they can help us identify the processes underlying these effects of neighborhood change. That is, with simulations, we can actually see, well, why was the intervention on collective efficacy having no effect on disparities? We can actually understand those mechanisms that may be giving rise to those unintended effects. And that can be very valuable if we're going to then intervene and invest in millions of dollars in community trials. It's better to have that information before we do that. And in sum, I think the ultimate objective of epidemiology is really to inform public health practice. And I think there's a need now to shift, in order for epidemiology to be really relevant, and that's something that people have been asking more and more, especially with the decreasing NIH funding, is how can epidemiology really matter? And I think epidemiology can really matter if we shift from focus solely on observation to research that guides intervention. And we can investigate and use these creative approaches to investigate the limits and the unintended effects of intervention, but also to recognize that the solution, particularly to problems such as violence, will never be solely a public health solution, right? We need to work with other sectors. We need to evaluate the potential for non-health policies to impact violence. And policies that will actually address these fundamental causes of disease that give rise to violence and to disparities in violence. So in terms of some of the research ahead, I'm doing research on a number of areas related to violence, not only the research that I just talked about, but particularly in this area of intervention. We're doing some research on racial disparities in alcohol-related homicide, trying to use simulations to figure out what might be the best neighborhood level interventions to reduce racial disparities in alcohol-related homicide. Because it turns out that even though blacks drink much less than whites, they're actually much more likely to die, 7 times more likely to die from alcohol-related homicide than whites. We're also very interested in the mental health sequelae of violence, and we're trying to figure out what's the cost effectiveness of investing in treatment for violence-related PTSD versus investing in prevention of violence that gives rise to post-traumatic stress disorder. And finally, we have some ideas for proposals to try to simulate the impact that a public health approach would have on firearm violence. So there's been a lot of publications, a lot of work, some produced out of Garen's group, writing about the need for a public health approach to violence, firearm violence prevention. And so we'd like to be able to test out what that would look like and what's the potential impact that, particularly at the city level, a series of a group of interventions on violence prevention would have on firearm violence. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank my funders and collaborators in this work. Thank you.
So I've been the bad guy with the watch all day, and I'm going to continue that role. Give me just a second to look. What's your schedule? Sorry.
I'm open.
Okay. So maybe 10 minutes for comments and
Okay.
discussion.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Karen, you want me to keep it going?
Yes, please.
Have you done any work to validate the simulations? It occurs to me that you could, like, find a situation where some simulable thing has actually happened in real life, use the assumptions that you've done, and seeing if what you get in your simulation, in fact, is correct, correctly predicts what has already happened in this real life situation. Has that been done?
Yes, yes. So part of that is just try what I showed you with the calibration data to see can we replicate initial baseline rates. So that serves to validate the model in terms of are we able to reproduce baseline processes, baseline probabilities of disease.
But what about interventions?
Right.
Yeah, so there's 2 ways. Well, one way that we could do that is, so what does the literature tell us about what the expected effect that these interventions would have? And so can we use the intervention to predict, first of all, to predict future rates? So especially if we have, that's something that we're going to do with the alcohol-related stuff. We have multiple years of data. Can we predict what's going to happen in the future, right? With how we've specified the model in terms of neighborhood influences. Can we predict future rates of homicide? So does the model, do the neighborhood dynamics work in such a way to reflect the future in terms of population level rates? And then also, sometimes what we do is we compare with observational data in terms of like validation, like you do with construct validity, with psychometric measures, where you say, do these factors, are they correlated to factors that have been observed in the literature in a similar way? Does a decrease, for example, or does an increase in collective efficacy in our model lead to a comparable effect to what you'd see, what the data tells us? And we could do that in New York because we've actually done observational studies on collective efficacy and violence. So we have data to be able to compare our results to the results of observational data.
And it's favorable, I'm hearing, that is when you put in all your assumptions
Yeah.
and everything, say about Medellin, your model reveals the same change that in fact was seen in Medellin. Is that correct? That
Right, so we haven't done it in
post-hoc
Medellin,
evaluation?
but
Well,
for New York, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Thank you.
And so actually that's, it's also a way to help you figure out, so with these models, the great thing is that you have to be very specific about the mechanisms, right? You have to really think carefully about how these mechanisms are going to, how these agents are going to interact and how that's going to lead to emergent characteristics at the neighborhood level. And so especially when you start with the models and you specify these baseline probabilities, sometimes you get probabilities that don't make sense. And so then you have to go back and say, okay, well, what assumptions have I made about agent behaviors that may be problematic? And so that helps you think more specifically about mechanisms. and about your own assumptions, your own model assumptions, which I think is very useful. But yeah, the comparison with real data is always important.
Just a couple of questions kind of going back to your work in Medellin. So, you know, a couple of issues that come up in injury epidemiology that I'm sure you've thought about a lot and you probably modeled somehow in your dissertation. So one is that violence, of course, is geographically movable. And so it may be that building the gondola would, you know, force bad guys away from the area of the gondola, but into other communities. So there could be this sort of geographic movement so that your control communities look like they're getting worse, but it's the same bad guys who are causing the violence. So there's that issue, and then there's also this kind of funny concept that probably doesn't pertain so much, but it comes into play a lot in unintentional injury epidemiology, which is this concept of risk compensation, you know, or risk homeostasis, that you do things to reduce people's risk of being injured, and they take that as an opportunity to change their behavior, to engage in higher risk behaviors than they would have otherwise, and that may manifest itself in other types of injury that perhaps were not part of the original scope of measurement. So I'm just wondering, you know, how these issues come into play at all in your work, your neighborhood-based work in violence.
Yeah, so the first issue is something we were really concerned about. We looked at it two ways. One is we looked at where people ended up, so the residential mobility of the original residents, so before the intervention happened, versus after, were the same people living in the same neighborhoods or had they moved to other neighborhoods. And actually there was very low rates of mobility. So we found that I don't remember what it was now, but the rate of residential mobility, or out mobility, was very low. So we could actually with confidence say we're looking at the same people over time. And it's not that, especially what we were concerned about was, besides spillover, was gentrification, where, you know, these neighborhoods look better because more well-off people moved in, the houses became more expensive, the poor people moved out. But we didn't find that to be the case. In terms of also...
So you don't have bad guys moving out of the neighborhood, but it could still well be that there are bad guys that never lived in the neighborhood to begin with, that caused the crime in the neighborhood, and then decided to move over to another neighborhood to cause the same crime, hypothetically.
Yeah. That could be. We used a statistical approach called randomization-based inference that's supposed to give you robust effects even in the context of spillover. So that we could actually, so it gives you a conservative estimate, but even under the greatest assumptions of spillover from one community to the next, can you still detect an effect? And so we were able to still detect an effect. However, I am still interested in something that we haven't done and I would like to do is map these potential effects of spillover. And also not only spillover, but just the spatial decaying patterns of influence. So I think that right along the gondola route, there might have been a much stronger effect than the further you get from the gondola route. Because the intervention was really focused along the gondola route and not the whole neighborhood. And so I would love to be able to look at that as well.
So just as an aside, in criminology, the terms that get used are displacement and diffusion of benefit. It's that the gondola route's well lighted now, so I'm going to take my criminal career elsewhere, regardless of where I may live. And sometimes there is displacement, and sometimes there is diffusion of benefit, and nobody's been able to figure out what predicts one to the other.
It's a very hard question to answer.
Yeah, a quick and dirty way for this would be, depending on how far away the control communities were, did crime go up there or go down by a lesser amount?
It went down by a lesser amount.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Did people use the gondola?
Yes, they did. Yeah, they found it to be they said that they never they said they had never realized how poor they were until this gondola came to be, because now they were able to actually get to the city center and see how other people lived. So it was actually a very powerful thing, both positive and negative.
What happened to crime rates in the city center?
They also decreased. So there was a decrease in the whole city. Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
hypothesis.
yeah. No, that's a good
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
That's why Georgetown kept the metro out.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Why did they use a gondola instead of a metro or a bus or something like that? Is it
Because
just
it's
to be built?
mountainous. It's very mountainous. So you have the metro running from the city center along the river, and then it's a very steep mountain. So they had buses before, but it's the very windy paths.
Yeah.
The roads are terrible. That leads to a lot of traffic injury, and so they were hoping to decrease that, declutter traffic. Traffic is a huge problem.
Yeah.
So that's some of the
I
reasons.
think it's very creative.
It is.
Yeah.
It is very creative. But I don't know about the compensation of risk. We looked at some other outcomes as well. Like we looked at drinking, drug use, other types of violence. We didn't see an effect on any of them, neither an increase or a decrease. But I would be interested. And the traffic injuries, I would think it would be a positive effect on traffic injuries just because there's less traffic. But I don't know about other kinds of injuries, other type like falls.
But that classic game would be, we'll say there's less traffic, but now people drive faster. And so they
Yeah.
drive faster, so they're more likely to actually
Yeah.
cause injuries when they
Yeah.
hit people.
Right, risk
It's a little bit of screwy theory. but-
And it turns out you have to know that you're protected. Put airbags in cars and don't
Yeah,
tell
exactly.
anybody. They'll change their behavior.
Yeah.
Put them in
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
anybody else? Well, thank you again. It
Thank
was
you.
great. I appreciate it very much. So how do you want to proceed from here? Up to your
I can
office?
take it across the lawn.
Okay. I'll